This is actually my second time shooting this video because the first time my eyelash was really falling off through the whole thing and it was very distracting. So I'm just gonna keep checking my eyelashes, don't mind me. So this is another craft video. I mentioned that I've been wanting to do a lot more of those on my channel, and so I'm doing that. One of the things that I wanted to mention really quickly is that I've basically been trying to find a way to make these slightly more interesting than like your average college physics lecture. So I am tinkering with a couple of different methods and like visual things to really help add some oomph. So yeah, I guess bear with me. If you see some like weird stuff going on, you know, don't mind me. I'm just trying out new things. On to today's topic, we are going to be talking about villain redemption arcs and specifically how to structure them using Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, or my slightly modified version of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. We're going to be talking a lot about the hero's journey as a whole and redemption arcs and all the steps that sort of I feel like are important when it comes to creating a thoughtful and meaningful redemption arc, because I really am a sucker for these stories. I feel like most people are. It's just that not a lot of them in contemporary media are done super well, and I think a lot of that is because writers tend to want to skip over the middle chunk of it, the part where the villain is actually, you know, working and fighting to become a redeemed, better person. That's really like a shame to me, especially because for the most part, you know, when you look at a villain who is destined for redemption, you kind of know what's coming and you kind of know what their point C is going to be. And if you just focus on point A and point C, you're not really thinking about the journey to get there. That's why I picked the hero's journey over other sort of narrative structure concepts, I guess. I really want to focus on the journey part of these types of stories. As usual, my disclaimer is going to be that your mileage may vary. Not everything I say may be the right fit for you, and you shouldn't really follow any writing advice to the letter. Prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds, and we don't really do that here. But I'm hoping that everything that I'm about to go into will be some source of inspiration, or maybe jog something into place, or provide a really basic foundation for you to work off of if you're crafting your own redemption arc narrative. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So the hero's journey is a sort of really rudimentary story structure template. The hero's journey can be really commonly seen in any sort of like adventure or quest type narrative. Star Wars is sort of like the archetypical example. It follows the trajectory of the hero's journey pretty much perfectly. But to give you a basic rundown, the hero's journey typically starts with the hero in a place of naivety. We're thinking like farm boys, you know, space farm boys. Why can I only think of farm boys? They end up getting a call to adventure and undergoing a series of trials and challenges in order to change and grow and become the hero that they need to be. So basically it's an ascension into hero-dom. And you see this in that a lot of the hero's journey sort of graphs, like this one, are very circular. While the hero may physically end up in the same place where they began, they are fundamentally changed on the inside. And that's sort of the part that we're going to focus on with our villain redemption arcs, like what does the villain undergo to make them change in this way? So the first sort of point that you start most stories in is the main character's state of normalcy. A lot of the time for, you know, our naive farm boy types or everyman types, this is pastoral, it's peaceful, it's quiet, and they have to get pulled out of that world somehow. But in the case of a villain's redemption arc, it's not this like peaceful state of normalcy for them, it's their villainous self. They're, you know, participating in doing bad things, and that's normal for them. So to like go into that for a second, and into the starting points for the villains who do get redemption arcs, there are two sort of main, broadly speaking, types of bad guys in my opinion. There are those who lack agency and are sort of serving a greater evil than themselves. Maybe they've been brainwashed or manipulated or literally don't know anything or any better outside of what they've always been told. And this is typically the villain who starts out with a sort of like inkling that what they're doing is wrong. Like they're a reluctant villain, they don't really want to do this, but they don't see that they have any other choice. In the case of this villain, it's typically a story about them being able to break free from the clutches of this greater evil. But then in the second situation, we have a villain who is fully aware that what they're doing is bad, either revels in it or doesn't care, and is usually 100% convinced that they're in the right. This is the harder villain to redeem on two fronts. On one hand, you have the audience. You have to convince them that this character who is doing bad things and is fully aware that they're doing bad things can be redeemed. And you also have to convince the character that change will be worthwhile. But while this is more of a challenge narratively speaking, I feel like if it's done well, it's usually done really well, and it's a lot more satisfying personally. I just think the payoff is really nice when you get this person who undergoes a full transformation internally. Sort of tangentially related to that, one of my biggest pet peeves is definitely when writers are sort of like afraid or hesitant to make their villain really genuinely bad. I feel like there is a tendency to sort of hold back in terms of villains and make them more palatable to the audience by making them, from the get-go, like not really a terrible person. In general, I just think I would like to see more full-on, like truly atrocious villains, because sometimes the sort of weaker villains, as in villains who haven't really done that much bad, they have a really like frictionless route to redemption, so I think there's some correlation there. So I think the deeper, like darker, worse villains can have the potential to be more interesting. That's all. Don't be afraid to let your villain do bad things at the start. If you write your redemption arc effectively enough, the audience will forgive almost anything. I won't say anything because there are some lines that definitely shouldn't be crossed. If they like murder a kid or murder anyone, literally there are franchises, I won't name any names, where the heroes have a higher body count than the villain because the writers were too afraid to make the villain kill people. I just think that's really interesting and not in a very good way. But yeah, sort of going back to what I just said about lines that shouldn't be crossed, I feel like generally speaking, like every crime is relative. Like for example, in Game of Thrones, you don't even blink an eye if someone murders someone else. Like that's totally fine. If they killed 10 people in like a gruesome battle, that's, you know, that's just par for the course in that world. But in a fluffy contemporary rom-com, if one of the bad guys or antagonists of the story murders 10 people, they're probably going to go to prison and don't really deserve a redemption arc. Like the audience is going to frown upon that more. So it's all relative and contextual. But anything that's like racially motivated genocide, like an ethnic cleansing, yeah, those are all sort of things that I feel like if your villain crosses that line, the audience isn't going to really accept a redemption arc from that character. So now that we have established your villain's starting point, we can move on to the actual fun stuff, which is the beginning of their journey. The first step in Campbell's hero's journey is the call to adventure. So this is basically an event, or sometimes a character who is causing an event, that drags the protagonist from their state of normalcy into the plot, basically. In a villainous context, this would probably be the inciting incident for their eventual turn. This might be, you know, the sort of splash of cold water to the face that they need to realize that, hey, like what I'm doing is bad and I should probably consider or start to consider changing that. I don't really have a really good example for what this might look like in a redemption arc, unfortunately. What I will say is that it should be a pretty marked departure from their state of normalcy. It should be a sort of drastic jolt that puts everything into perspective for them for at least a moment. However, after the call to action, the next step is refusal of the call. So in general, people tend to be resistant to change, especially really large change that requires them to change everything about themselves. A villain character who is really stuck in their ways and can't see the light at the end of the tunnel at all will be even more resistant to change than a normal person. But this is an important beat because it is the perfect opportunity to show the villain's main hurdle. So a character's hurdle is whatever is preventing them from reaching their goal or reaching wherever they need to be. It could be their primary motivation for doing what they're doing in the first place. It could be internalized self-loathing or that exterior force we talked about, that greater evil. A lot of the times it can also boil down to a really deeply rooted belief that the villain has gone too far, like they've done too many bad things and they no longer deserve redemption. So they won't even try. A really good example comes from one of my favorite shows, which is HBO's Barry. In this show, the main character is a professional hitman who really does want to be a good person, or at least like a normal person, but his greatest hurdle is that he literally doesn't know how to do that. He doesn't have any of the tools to be a better person or even like a functionally normal one. So all of his attempts to redeem himself or like do good deeds result to him like reverting back to his old methods, which are murder because he's a hitman. So the next sort of line of thinking we should be going into is how do we overcome this hurdle? Step 3 in Campbell's hero's journey is supernatural aid. I think I'm just going to call it aid because I think the supernatural bit is unnecessary. But anyway, basically this is the point where an exterior force, usually another character who maybe represents something to the main character or represents something that they lack, someone who's basically in an elevated position. So that's why it's called a supernatural aid. But I feel like this can vary a lot. Basically, this is a character who either pulls or pushes the main character into whatever direction they need to go to start on their journey. So this would be a character who not forces, but convinces the villain that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. They just actually need to work for it for once. So this is, I guess, where we start with Act 2 of this redemption arc journey. And it's where all the fun stuff happens, but it's also where my structural tips get the weakest. Act 2 is the fun and games of the story. It's the meat of the journey. It should be really specifically tailored to your main character or villain or whoever else so that it specifically challenges their character. So yeah, just by like virtue of what Act 2 is, my structural tips are a little bit weaker, but I'm going to try to hit some of the basic beats that I think are important and like go from there. Basically, the function of Act 2 or this journey is to provide a series of trials and challenges for the villain to overcome and learn lessons from. So we're forcing change by basically putting them through the meat grinder. Like, we're beating the pulp out of them so they can become a better person. I guess another way to think of it is splitting the villain's redemption arc journey into a bunch of like smaller bite-sized lessons and then designing each trial or challenge around a specific lesson. That's a really basic way of putting it, and it might be a little bit difficult, but I'm going to go ahead and show you guys my example really quickly. I'm just going to read off my laptop because there is no way that I can memorize all this stuff. Don't judge me.
All right, so let's say that we have this hypothetical villain, and it's someone whose main hurdle is that they struggle with a lack of empathy. Again, this is just sort of an example that I've concocted. It's not anything too specific, but they probably have a violent past and a violent present, and ultimately, they don't see living beings as worth saving or sparing. To some extent, this also applies to the villain's perception of themselves. They don't think that they're worthy of empathy either, which creates yet another obstacle toward their eventual redemption. And in order to achieve significant internal change and be redeemed, this villain needs to learn one really big lesson, and it's that all living things are worthy of empathy and deserve to live, including the villain themselves. So for our first lesson, the villain will have to learn how to empathize or care for one other person, just one other individual aside from themselves. Through caring about a single individual, potentially one who might represent the innocence they lost or never had, or a character who reaches out to them when no one else will, and thus sort of represents their own potential. This villain is opening themselves up to learning the value of empathy. So with this lesson in mind, I feel like the trial could be pretty straightforward. Like, the villain is going to go out of their own way to protect this particular individual from harm, or protect them from the cruelty of the world. Maybe this individual is at risk of falling down the same path that the villain once did, so they want to stop that, protect that innocence, protect their own potential. And then the next step, or, the second lesson would be the villain learning to empathize or care for innocence as a whole. Here, our hypothetical villain starts to see innocent people as more than just, bodies. Now that they've sort of come to understand the value of innocence through that first character, they might be able to even extend that sort of compassion toward an entire group of innocents, or innocence as a whole. So for trial 2, the villain would again go out of their way and put themselves on the line to save an entire village of innocent people, perhaps from the very organization that they used to serve. If they serve some sort of like evil company, I don't know. And this would mark a pointed turn toward the light, because they are starting to sort of contribute to the greater good, even if it's somewhat reluctantly. And then lesson 3 takes that a step further, in that the villain will learn to empathize with their enemy, who in this case would probably be the hero of the story. So the third trial for this villain would be to ultimately, outside of whatever physical trial or physical combat might be going on, this trial is actually more internal. It would be the villain potentially acknowledging that they have been in the wrong this whole time. They don't necessarily have to do any sort of full side switch here, but they either concede a fight or aid the hero in some small way, or just spare them after winning a fight. Again, it's doesn't have to be a physical fight, but It's just showing that their allegiance has begun to shift, that their perspective has begun to shift. It's a big step in admitting that they were wrong. So for trial 4, now that we're sort of jumping off of that point, the villain's perspective has shifted, and now they're going to have to face someone who is just as bad as they used to be. This could be another sort of antagonistic force, perhaps again sent by whatever evil corporation they used to work for. And this is sort of like the final trial. The villain is forced to confront a reflection of their own worst self or who they used to be, and they have to fully come to terms with their misdeeds before defeating this, new villain in one way or another. But this character isn't the same person that they used to be. At this point, they've pretty much solidified their lesson in the value of empathy. And when it comes time to end this other villain's life, they end up sparing them instead. And this could potentially kickstart a redemption arc or something, some sort of redemptive awakening within the secondary villainous character. So now that this final task or deed has been done, lesson 5 is that the villain finally recognizes that they are also worthy of empathy. And this would probably come directly on the heels of them sparing that other villainous character. That's sort of a reflection of themselves moment. But it also comes hand in hand with the realization that they have changed. So they fully open themselves up to redemption, and there's maybe a final act or apotheosis to show just how far they've come and how much they're willing to risk to save other people at this point. And then there's a happy ending. Or not. I don't know. Again, this is just a really basic framework that I cobbled together to sort of prove my point. And the beauty of story structure is that you can pretty much do whatever you want with it. The whole idea here is that the villain, like any other character, has to fight and undergo challenges and trials in order to become who they need to be. I feel like the lessons are just a pretty straightforward and simple way to think about that series of challenges.
So now that the villain has undergone their transformative redemption arc, where do we go from here? A really popular choice, or one that has cropped up more than I'd like it to, is, as I mentioned, for the villain to ultimately self-sacrifice to aid the heroes in some way. I have thoughts about this. While I do think that it can work in some narratives, I feel like there's an over-reliance on this trope, and it's become almost like a joke. The thing is that audiences who watch this redemption arc, especially if it's a really well fleshed out, thought out redemption arc, they kind of want to see the villain win at the end or be somehow rewarded for their efforts outside of a cheap moment of happiness when they die. But I think it almost goes beyond that. Honestly, after watching a villain undergo an internal redemption arc, what I really want to see is how they adjust and adapt to the new world and how they have to reconcile the fact that they are fundamentally different on the inside. But the people in the rest of the world might not know that. The people they've harmed especially might have a really hard time coming to terms with this concept of hey, this person who killed your parents is now one of us, a good guy. And I think there's a lot of potential for exploration there. There is this marked difference between who the villain is now and who they used to be. And not everyone else was along with along on the ride and watching this transformation happen. So how is this villain going to navigate the world now that they've changed? So for that reason, I feel like any sort of abrupt cutoff right after the villain has their apotheosis, I'm just going to say it a little differently every time and hope that one of the times I'm right. There's always at least one word that I just can't say, so I don't know. It's a meme at this point, who cares? Anyway, if the redemption arc just cuts off there, we're not seeing the denouement, we're not seeing the, return, so to speak. They probably can't go back to where they used to be physically because I'd assume someone would murder them. I do want to see consequences. I want to see them return. You know what it is? The return to home, or whatever that last beat is called. For the villain, it's returning to the world that they fundamentally made a worse place with their misdeeds, but they are fundamentally changed on the inside, and how do they handle that? Wow, so many people just skip over that part. Anyway, I think there's just a lot of potential for narratives to sort of continue a little bit past and show how the villain is going to put the work in now that they've changed internally to sort of convince everyone else, and maybe show how they deal with people who just aren't able to forgive them flat out. So yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of the abrupt cutoff, even if it is a happy ending where they get the love interest or whatever. It just doesn't really do it for me. Oh my god, okay, so that was really, really long and I'm starving, so I have to go. But thank you so much for sitting through this. I feel like this is going to be a 40-minute long video, or I mean, like, honestly, I'm afraid to look at how much footage I have to edit. I hope this was somewhat illuminating. Once again, like, obviously your mileage may vary, and this is not one-size-fits-all advice. It's just a sort of like foundational thing that you can lay your stories on, or not. If you don't agree with anything I said, that's also fine. Anyway, I upload a new video every Thursday or Friday. This one's probably going up on Friday. If you like this one, I always forget to say this, but go ahead and subscribe or leave a like. Like and subscribe. I literally don't know what order to say it in. And otherwise, I'll be seeing you guys next week.